time to be here today, and welcome to the Politics and Policy Symposium, the first of three topics of the theme Indigenous Peoples in Canada. My name is Denis Desjardins, it's Denis, and I'll be your host today. Now my great pleasure to introduce you to the moderator for this symposium, Mr. Morris Schweitzer. Mr. Schweitzer, or Morris?
Or Switzer.
Switzer. Morris is a journalist and educator, and is the Shog Dotem.
Chicago.
Thank you.
Remember Chicago?
Shog. Alderville First Nation, and has Mississauga, Haudenosaunee, okay, and Jewish ancestry, and was the first Indigenous student to attend Trent University. He has served as Director of Communications for the Assembly of First Nations and the Union of Ontario Indians, was on the faculty of the First Nations Technical Institute, Canadore College, Huntington University, and the Aboriginal Leadership Program at Banff Centre. A journalist since 1965, he served as editor and publisher of 7 newspapers. He is a member of the Nipissing District Human Rights Hall of Fame and 2010 recipient of an Anishinaabe Nation Lifetime Achievement Award. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a great round of applause for Morris Schweitzer.
Miigwech. Benezi Dijnakas, Shkog Dodam Anishinaabe, Mangan Dodam Hodnashoni, Chike Ashkibewas, Alderville Donjiba, Anishinaabe Kendao. I'm really pleased to be invited to this wonderful event, and Donald Tapscott kicked it off in a wonderful way, except he's put everybody behind for the rest of the day, but we'll do what we can. You should know that 250 years ago, right now, one of the most monumental events that ever took place on this continent was happening near Niagara Falls at Fort Niagara. And the events that took place there involved over 2,000 Indigenous leaders, chiefs and headmen of 24, there probably were a few more nations at that event. And the event was called by Sir William Johnson on behalf of the King, the King of Canada, the King of North America, and of settler North America. And he called the meeting to meet with the leaders to emphasize the importance of the previous fall's Royal Proclamation. The Royal Proclamation had 2 main substantive components, one of which recognized that the Indian tribes of North America were to be regarded as nations of people. And the second key part, was to acknowledge the existence of Aboriginal title. That's a legal term which means you're here first, you own the land. You own the land. So these men accepted Sir William Johnson's invitation to attend this event, and this wampum belt was exchanged with the leaders. It's called the Treaty of Niagara Covenant Chain Wampum Belt. This is a constitutional document. It may be Canada's first constitutional document. The fact that none of you in this room, or very few of you, have ever heard of what I'm just telling you, or have ever seen that document, it talks a lot about what Donald Tapscott was saying about how our education needs to change. Maybe computerized knowledge will speed up the ability with which people can learn about their own country's history. It's significant that on June 26th last, that's 250 years after this event, at which First Peoples, the nations of the Great Lakes, Indigenous nations, were told that promised our people would never be poor, that we would always be able to share the use of our traditional lands and prosper as long as we allowed Europeans to settle here and to be their allies in war as well as friends in peace. 250 years later, the Supreme Court of Canada decreed that yes, indeed, there is such a thing as Aboriginal title to specific land in this country. The fact that it took the courts of one of the most democratic nations in the world 2.5 centuries to come to the conclusion that their own political leaders did, again, 2.5 centuries earlier, shows the need for increased education among Canadians about their own country. The fact that when many Canadians see people wearing masks or camouflage trying to protect their rights and their lands on the newscasts, the reason they're doing that is because they were promised that they would never have to do that. That's very significant, this date and this time. So what we're going to try to do in this short period with some very prominent and well-respected voices is to help you understand the level of frustration and concern that is mounting among Indigenous peoples in this country and around the world, by the way. There are over 500 million Indigenous peoples around the world. That the promises that were made, that the agreements that we made to share in the prosperity of the world's land base, it's time that those issues be addressed, again, as Don Tapscott said, in a different way, because obviously what's been happening has not been working. So I'm very pleased that we've got people of the caliber here to speak. Each person has been promised 20 minutes to speak, but now we're told we might have to cut some corners. But I'm going to introduce in a short way each panelist until I get to our first speaker. Before each person speaks, I'll introduce them at greater length. So I'd like to first introduce at my far left Rosemary Kuptana, who's an Inuit activist, honorary Trent degree recipient. And next to her, we have Danielle Jeancart, who is a 2008 member of the class 2008. She's a researcher, writer, and educator. To my immediate left, we have Wanda Nanabush, class of 96, curator, artist, and author. To my right...
Not that old.
Not that old, no. To my right, Russell Diebold, class of 77, who's a policy advisor, Algonquin Nation Secretariat. He's a publisher of the First Nations Strategic Bulletin, which I encourage you all to read if you want to get a better awareness of what's really going on in Indian country than you can get from mainstream media. And then on my far right, he's the recipient of an honorary degree from Trent University. He's a former chief of Temagami First Nation. And I'm going to read a bit more information before Gary Potts addresses us. Gary is the former chief of the Temagami First Nation in the Temagama Anishinaabe in Temagami, Ontario, Canada, which is not far from where I come from in North Bay. He was a leader of the Red Squirrel Road blockades in 1988-89 to protect the old growth of forests that you may have read about or heard about. That was part of Temagami's struggle to protect their ancestral lands. And Gary told me that he's been in the bush and out of politics, but as Rosemary Kuptana said, I don't think Indigenous peoples ever retire. And Gary has lived close to the land all his life, and he has always spoken about the need to keep Indigenous knowledge and understanding of the land. And I'm looking at an article that appeared in the North Bay Nugget some years ago. He says, Canadian people will lose a great deal of knowledge and understanding of the present government policy of complete integration into white society if the present government policy of complete integration into white society is followed. And he credits staying close to the land and trapping, hunting, fishing with giving him that link that helps him feel very strongly about this nation. We want to work with you, not against you. When this comes to pass, and I'm sure it will, the Canadian nation will have one of the strongest societies in the world. So I'd like to ask Gary Potts if he would start our discussion.
First of all, I'd like to begin by thanking the ancestors of the Indigenous Peoples for the work that they did in their time, with very little to work with, that enables us to be here today. It's always been difficult, you know, no matter how many years you spend in this. You may be never retired, but you get worn out, you know, times and that, and sort of start living in your own echo chamber if you're not careful. And sometimes it's quite difficult to stay out of your own echo chamber when people, you know, attach you or identify you to something that happened quite some time ago. But it's important, I think, that in acknowledging the ancestors, our ancestors, and the things that they went through now to make sure that we could be here, is that they continue to be. They're always important. They kept us alive. Morris touched on the talk that I gave. That's 42 years ago. I was a young trapper and bushman raised on the on the land. And I think it's important that I read all of what I said. Just giving that to Morris so he would be aware and have a record of what a background to it. This is what I said. It was on Valentine's Day, a closing banquet of the Ontario Trappers Convention on February 14th, 1972. I'm glad to attend the convention. I've learned many things and met many interesting people. I would like to say something for the Native people. Being a Native myself, these are my views. Like all associations for working people, the OTA, that's Ontario Trappers Association, is a great thing, and it will become even greater with the participation of the Native people. The majority of white trappers that I have spoken to have made me feel welcome here. It took me years to develop the courage to speak to people. You have to take into consideration that we, the Native people, have been told that our way of life is wrong ever since the white man first came to our country. And we, being people that basically want to get along with people, allowed ourselves to be led this way, not realizing that the end result, what the end result would be. Because of this, we are in great danger of losing our language and heritage. In my opinion, the Canadian people will lose a great deal of knowledge and understanding of the present government policy, if the present government policy of complete integration into white society is followed. The result will be the loss of what can be described as a complete Canadian culture forever. If the white people want the Native people to take an active role in the Canadian nation, we can only give true representation when the government recognizes our heritage. And when this happens, the government will see that proud Natives can and will contribute a great deal to the Canadian nation. We want to work with you, not against you. And when this comes to pass, I'm sure it will, the Canadian nation will have one of the strong societies in the world. What we had done at that time, I look back at this, it was written upstairs in the Empire Hotel in North Bay, and it was just like I was being told what to say. Our family wife, Doreen, our mother of our family at that, turned on the radio, said, turn off the radio, it's interfering with what I'm being told. So I wrote that. And I looked back at it at various times, and I said, I can't get over how naive I was, looking back at it 42 years later. At the time, I was naive. And then, at the time now, I still feel like I'm naive in many ways, because it was almost like a Pollyanna view of what Canada could be, but isn't, and still isn't. It was, and it continues to be an ongoing struggle within me to maintain some civility. Start rapping. So in that way, I feel like I'm a time traveler. The people I grew up with, they traveled in birch bark canoes. Birch bark highways were the waters, you know, and the winterways are for toboggans, and those are the people I grew up with. And then they made me chief in October of '72, and then another world started for me when we were just about, well, the genocide was almost complete by the provincial government of Ontario in particular against the Tamagami Indians. And the federal government was almost a facilitator for them in moving this forward, because we had never signed any treaty. We had never been invited to sign any treaty. And we had asked for all of our documentation that the Indian Affairs District Office in Sudbury was holding for us to be sent to our office. And we told them we don't want the Indian Asians coming to our community anymore. So that was my first written letter as chief to the Department of Indian Affairs. And they sent it all in, and it was in black and white. They were never invited to treaty. They never sold. You know, they never signed any treaty, along with a lot of other things. So our policy and practice of dealing with the Crown, our policy was to get along, because our ancestors had, you know, fought for the Crown, with the Crown, and when the Crown was against us, we fought against them and beat them. It's our land, it's always been our land, and always will be our land, period. And in discussion. What had happened was, when the provincial agents, game wardens, or forest rangers come on our area first time in 1901, our men had a meeting about them, heard they were coming in and had a meeting. A number of our men wanted to kill them outright, because they had heard what they had done, these provincial agents, done to our brothers and sisters in different parts of Ontario. So kill them was the first step that had to be taken. However, the discussion started. And there were some voices in there that they didn't say don't kill them. They said let's delay it. Let's wait until we see what they really want. So that's the way our people approached it. That was our policy, and our practice then became surviving what they really wanted. They wanted to get rid of us. And that was stated. Andrew Paul, who from the Squamish, had come to Bear Island a couple of times in the late 40s, and once in 1953, and Alec Paul gave a big speech when he was there in 53 in our land, that the white man will always want our land. He said, the Kimanan, Shaganas will always want the Kimanan. We've got to go all out to protect the Kimanan. So it was always about protecting the land and sharing the land with the white people who were coming in. So we were faced with this dilemma. Well, we're going to have to start killing white people to save the land, because they're destroying the land. They're turning out like maggots. What do we do? So the discussion, well, we'll go to court. So we went to court. And we went from, put a caution on 10,000 square miles of, or 4,000 square miles of land. I keep getting kilometers and miles mixed up now at this time. That was introduced at the last third of my life, kilometers. Anyway, so so this is another adaptation that, as an Indigenous person, I have to make. But anyways, so we went through that whole phase of the cautions and struggle. That was 19 years, and the court, after the trial levels and the appeal courts, who didn't want to touch the trial level at all, so they were trying to find ways to dance around that without addressing the fact that the trial level had not been had been very biased against us, and there was no question of that, because it was a whole It was the first time in Ontario for quite some time that this form of claim has come forward to be dealt with legally. So at that time, we're also dealing with the constitutional process. Constitution was brought over from England in '82, signed April 17th, and in that it said we're going to define and the people and their rights. One of the first steps that we did as leaders was to take that out of the Constitution and have it state that all the future conferences are going to deal with constitutional matters that directly affect us. The constitutional matters that directly affect us was Section 109 of the British North America Act, that where the provinces had authority on their provincial lands, and we said, subject to existing interest. We are the existing interest. And the second part being that the federal Canada, any constitutional laws that are in violation of constitutional rights, Section 52 of the Constitution says they're of no void, they're void, they have no force. So we were happy, that was it, it was over. The threat was gone, and the scenario, the rest of the conference played out. But it was during that time, as a constitutional spokesperson and negotiator, I said to a few of my colleagues, because I traveled across the country with meeting the ministers and that, and I said to some of my colleagues, we've got to keep these people in Section 35. We've got to treat Section 35 like a holding pen for white people, because these people are dangerous. You know, and they're institutional, like, you don't realize, a lot of people in everyday life don't realize how dangerous your authority, you're their subjects, and they know it. And the institution of the province and the institution of the federal crown are going to make sure that they keep control of you, but on your behalf, get rid of Indians, because it's in the public interest to get rid of Indians. And that's what we were faced with, and it was quite obvious. But what had happened was the leaders of the day were too articulate for their leaders. So it looked like it was pretty shabby if they started trying to get rid of Indians in the face of when the Indian leaders were of a higher caliber than their leaders. And so they were quite, so we knew that this was taking place. But you can't go around beating your chest about it. You know, you have to keep it pretty low profile, because, as I said, very savage people in these crown institutions. They still wanted to commit genocide against us, period. To wipe us out, because we were interfering with the public interest. So that went on, the court cases went on, and as Morris pointed out, the latest court cases have come out. But prior to this, and it's still there in the treaty issues, that but the rights weren't absolute. The court said in Delgamuuk, they could be extinguished. So what the courts had done was constitutionalize genocide. We can extinguish you. No matter we got rights now, but we can extinguish you. So when that's a constitutional law, the government's very happy. Doesn't matter what all we have to do is identify that you are not, it's not in the public interest for that you to be there. So we'll extinguish you. So that still exists in the treaty case that was decided with the Grassy Narrows over the logging issue. The treaty said you extinguished it yourself 100 years ago. Well, nobody told the Grassy Narrows people when they were signing that treaty 100 years ago, you extinguishing yourself. When you signed that treaty, they never extinguished nothing. And they never will. Now it's a whole new fight for them. They're going to have to, you know, and they will fight. But the whole matter, we'll never be extinguished. That's the whole point, you know, of what I'm saying. But the responsibility for us is to, we've rolled back, they've hit the wall with our leadership across the country. We've got to take that step up now and take on responsibilities in our people, and that the fight against extinguishment is basically over. Now we've got to move forward and look at, well, Well, how do we take up to work with you as proud Indigenous peoples of nations that exist within the framework, federal framework of Canada? And that responsibility is on us as Indigenous peoples, it appears, more than it is on your institutions, because your institutions, the federal and provincial institutions, they still want to eliminate it. They're in shock right now. They're trying to figure out how the hell do we get around the Chilcotin case. They can't. What the court did was they removed extinguishment from the language. So you can't extinguish title anymore. You can't extinguish rights related to title. And what they did also was Indigenous people can't use their land in such a way that will prevent future generations from using their land the way they want it. Then said, well, how province, federal can infringe? Well, yeah, you can infringe on that. But then they put in there, and I'm paraphrasing, but you can't infringe on Indigenous people's land title if it prevents future Indigenous peoples from using their land. Because it becomes a hypocritical element. Why state you have Aboriginal title and it's there for everybody, for the future generations, but the province and the federals can come in and infringe it and take that away. That's still extinguishment. So they can't, but the courts, I believe, block that as well. So where title is gone, extinguishment is gone, from what the word looks like, but from the treaties, they're trying to, you say, anyone who has signed a treaty, extinguish themselves. And that's nonsense. So there's a whole new level of fight coming up. But the big one, excuse me, is going to be on us now. And there's a whole new world that's just opened up. Well, I shouldn't say that it's not going to be that easy. It's because the governments are still, I can rest assured that Harper's crew, made up of cabinet from Reform Party members from Western Canada and Mike Harris's cabinet members from Ontario, they are figuring out to call that can we have a constitutional conference together not to remove this Section 35 from the Constitution? Well, you look into that, see what it involves. All we need is 7 provinces and 50% of the population in Canada. Can we get that? That's in the works. I can guarantee you that right now. Will they be successful? I can guarantee you, no. Because they tried to take it out once. It went back in a few weeks later. Because we and our people stood up. And when we stand up, they back down. Just that simple. As one, when we stand together. When we stand up and fragmented all over the place, nothing happens. That's the reality. The taxpayers' organizations is now after Chief Salaries. Well, that's another way they're attacking us. And that's one of the biggest things that we've got to learn to deal with, because they stigmatize us, the taxpayer. Well, there's an Indian, I'm paying for him. I'm paying for her. I'm paying the taxpayer's the big shot on the block. When it comes to Indians, I've got it over you just because I'm paying taxes. Nobody's telling you, idiot, you're on our land, and your government was, the only reason you're here is that your government undertook to be the landlord for you, even for you to collect your taxes to pay us for the use of our land to make a living from our land. You know, how far do you want to go with this argument? But that's what they're doing, and the Harper's people are playing it up quite a bit in the public interest. And well, we can't have this separate societies in Canada and that, so we got to extinguish because the taxpayer corporation, our organization Canada, wants us to extinguish them. Well, because it's in the public interest. So we're still going to have to deal with that for maybe for another generation or two, in my view. And in closing, I just want to say again, I'm glad to attend the 50th anniversary of Trent Symposium. And I'd like to say something for a native person, being a native person myself, and this is what I have to say, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're here to stay.
Well, miigwech, Gary. No, we never retire, and once you're a leader, you're always a leader, and we're here to stay. And the person who famously said that was Justice Antonio Lemur in the Delgamuukw decision. You know, why fight? You know, negotiate, don't litigate. Why spend? Talk about taxpayers' dollars. Department of Indian Affairs spent $170 million last year on legal fees. Most of it in a conflict of interest to fight Aboriginal rights. That's your taxpayers' dollars. So, anyways, miigwech, Gary, for your passion and for your leadership and for your obvious love of the land.
And your rapping.
And your rapping. And for staying within the time limit. Thank you. I want to introduce Russell Daibo, who's, as I said, is a policy advisor for the Algonquin Nation Secretariat. They're trying to complete a land claim settlement that's only taken them, what, 170 years? Is it longer? Yeah. Well, brief by comparison to some. And he's the publisher of the First Nations Strategic Bulletin, and I really encourage you to locate that online. It's really some of the best information you can find on First Nations and Aboriginal issues. Russell, as I said, is a policy advisor. He's a tribal council and senior policy advisor to the Algonquin Wolf Lake First Nation, and he's editor and publisher of the online newsletter I mentioned on First Nations political and legal issues, the First Nations Strategic Bulletin. He's, can I call you a citizen of the Mohawk Nation at Kahnawake, Quebec, and he's been an activist on First Nation issues since the age of 16 and part of the Defenders of the Land Network. He works closely with Idle No More under a joint agreement between these two groups to work together on Sovereignty Summer. And I just want to read you a comment in the Strategic Bulletin that, that was written by Russell. It's a war for ownership, control, management of Aboriginal title lands and Indigenous self-determination versus continued Crown racism, colonialism, and termination of the collective rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada. So those are pretty strong words, and I can't think of anybody that can deliver them better than Russell Daibo.
Thanks very much, Morris and Gary, for your comments. I remember Gary fighting when on the Bear Island case all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, you know, when the Constitution Act 1982 was new and shiny. And that was quite a few years ago now. When I left Trent, I went to work at the National Indian Brotherhood in Parliamentary Liaison, and my job was to do report cards on senators and MPs and their positions on status Indians, and to track bills and to understand the procedures in the House of Commons and the Senate and how legislation is passed and developed. So that helped train me for understanding, you know, more about the governance of Canada. I also, in the 90s, I was also Vice President of Policy for the Liberal Party of Canada, Aboriginal Peoples Commission from 1990 to 94. We had a falling out after that, but I helped set up that commission. It was an experiment. And it was when Jean Chrétien was elected in as leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. And so myself and others helped work on the 1993 Aboriginal platform of the Liberal Party. including the Red Book, Chapter 7 of the Red Book, but there was also a longer Aboriginal platform that was released. Basically, all those promises in there were either manipulated or broken by Prime Minister Chrétien. And when Ovid McCready burned the Red Book in 1996, myself and a couple other executive members of the Aboriginal Commission supported him because we said that we were basically betrayed by the Prime Minister when he asked us to get involved in working on the platform and the promises that were in there, which we helped develop, but we weren't responsible for them being broken. I bring that up because I have had some insight into the white political culture in Canada right up to the Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister's office once they formed the government. So I do know and understand how the federal government operates. I've been working with different First Nation communities for decades now. So as a policy practitioner, I do know the system pretty well. And my observation of it is that Canada is a racist colonial country. When the Prime Minister apologized for the residential schools, he didn't apologize for the racism and colonialism that exists in Canada. He only apologized for, and that was a court-ordered apology, because it was part of an agreement that the Assembly of First Nations made with the Government of Canada. So when he formed the government, he had to take over those obligations of that court order. So Harper didn't do that out of the kindness of his heart. But when he focused on just the residential schools, he didn't address the broader racist colonial relationship that has existed in Canada. It seems like every time we try to seek justice in Canada, the goalposts are moved. Section 35 is a good example of that. I observed the First Minister's conferences. I was in the room for all of them except the one in 1984 because I was going to school out of the country then, but I did see the videotapes of the proceedings. Basically, Section 35 was supposed to be, the new Constitution Act 1982 was supposed to be our way out of the colonial system. And in the BNA Act, or the Constitution Act 1867. Because this country is founded on the doctrine of discovery, which is a racist colonial doctrine. In fact, it was the first recommendation in the 1996 Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples is that the doctrines of discovery and terra nullius should cease to be used by the courts and by the governments, at the negotiating tables. But Canada's assertion of sovereignty is based on planting a flag. That's how they base their territorial integrity and their sovereignty over the country and over Indigenous peoples here. And it is a racist doctrine. They haven't repudiated it. And even the recent Supreme Court decision in Chilcotin on June 26th, I believe, of this year, just a little over a month ago. On the one hand, they recognized that Chilcotin had Aboriginal title, but on the other hand, they maintained this notion of the assertion of sovereignty over Canada and that the radical or underlying title in Canada is Crown title. That's a threat to us because that's a threat to our sovereignty, our self-determination, because Aboriginal title is really the underlying title to this country. Everything was built on top of it, But the courts have, taken a convoluted political position in that decision and advanced this notion that Crown sovereignty supersedes Indigenous sovereignty. And although they say in that decision that the terra nullius doesn't exist in Canada, I'd argue with the Chief Justice that she was ignoring the French regime in Quebec, because the French regime did advance the notion of terra nullius because they reviewed the area as uninhabited except by savages, infidels, non-Christians. And that was the view that they maintained, even though they had relations with First Nations during the French regime. But the Chilcotin decision really only started in talking about the Royal Proclamation of 1763. It didn't make mention of the Treaty of Niagara of 1764. The court also didn't address the issue of self-government because it wasn't raised by the Chilcotin in the case. But basically what I've seen is The government is very good at trying to shape public opinion, and they're very good at propaganda. We came up with the term self-government, and they took that term away from us and put a policy definition to it. And basically it means municipalization under their 1995 Aboriginal self-government policy. If you look at what that policy says, there won't be any sovereign First Nations recognized in there, in an international sense, they're saying. And what Canada is saying is Indigenous right to self-determination. They're telling the Human Rights Council at the UN that I think it was in 2007, they appeared and they were asked the question, what about Indigenous peoples in Canada? How is their self-determination being recognized? Canada's response is, well, they're part of the population of Canada, so as the government of Canada, we represent them too. And I believe they're appearing this fall. I think Indigenous groups have to go over there and give evidence to that UN committee to say that's not true. We have the right of self-determination as peoples. So this whole thing about Section 35, it was adopted in April 17th, 1982. The wording of it is, it says, we hereby recognize and affirm the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of Aboriginal peoples. When Gary said Section 35 was taken out, it didn't have the word existing in it. When they put it back in, it was put back in with the word existing. And Chrétien, who was the Justice Minister at the time, just says, oh, well, it just means they exist. That's why it's there. But it was the premiers of Alberta and Saskatchewan and British Columbia that wanted that word existing put in there, because they wanted to limit any future interpretation of that section by the courts. They were looking ahead already at how that section would be viewed. And basically, in 1983, there was what the Constitution said. There was a Section 37 in there that said there had to be a First Minister's Conference on Aboriginal Matters within 1 year. And that was the 1983 Constitutional Conference on Aboriginal Matters. The purpose of that conference was supposed to be to identify and define what was going to be included in Section 35, what rights were going to be included in there. But instead of doing that, in 1983, they amended the Constitution to provide for three more First Ministers' Conferences on Aboriginal matters and a schedule of agenda items. And the main agenda item, and Gary can correct me if I'm wrong in any of this, the main agenda item turned out to be self-government. And the debate in 1984 and 85 and 87 was whether self-government was an inherent right or a delegated right by the governments. And the debate, the metaphor that was used about Section 35 was the Aboriginal leadership of the national organizations, the 4 national Aboriginal organizations said, it's a full box. Section 35 recognizes our pre-existing rights. The governments, the Prime Minister and the Premier said no, it's an empty box and you have to negotiate an agreement with us to achieve self-government. And we're prepared to enter into a process of negotiation with you. All you have to do is agree to this process. And throughout those 3 First Ministers' Conferences, and from 1984 to 87, the answer was no. The Aboriginal organization said no, it's a full box. We're not prepared to say that it's empty and we're going to enter into a process where you're going to give us self-government because we already have it. And then in 1987, those conferences ended because Moroni had started secret negotiations with Bourassa to drop Aboriginal issues in constitutional reform and focus on Quebec's distinct society status. Of course, we saw where that went when it hit the Manitoba legislature with Elijah Harper, because the amending formula for that was 10 provinces, and they had to do it by the end of June. So Elijah Harper ran the clock out, Meech Lake ended, then we have the Gulf War in 1990 between the Mohawks and over the golf course at Oka. But and that's when the first Supreme Court decision came down, the Sparrow decision, starting to define the meaning of Section 35, because with the failure of those First Ministers' Conferences, the courts took over. And what the Supreme Court has done now is they laid out legal tests through various court cases. And they have what's called a Section 35 analysis. And now the governments and industry and everybody's using that Section 35 analysis to determine the likelihood of a group being able to advance their Aboriginal or treaty rights assertions in court. And what the courts have done in these legal tests is they've laid out the tests where the evidence you have to collect and to sustain these legal arguments cost millions, tens of millions of dollars. Even Chilcotin, I've heard, cost between 20 and 50 million. I don't know the exact cost, because it was, they did get court costs to get those covered. But the point is that it's beyond the ability of most First Nations in the country to be able to argue and sustain constitutional arguments for Aboriginal treaty rights. So where's the justice in that if you can't go to court? And what the government's doing to fill that vacuum is they're saying, we're ready to negotiate with you. We have land claims policies and we have a self-government policy. And those are what I call termination policies. In the United States, they had a policy of terminating tribal status down there, and I'm saying Canada has one too. It's to terminate the pre-existing sovereignty and rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada by getting them to concede to core preconditions in these agreements. Extinguishing Aboriginal title, accepting municipal status, and the thing that Chilcotin and the Keewatin decisions have in common is they're saying that the British North America Act, the provincial powers and federal powers will be over on top of First Nations powers, because that's really where colonialism came in. This Wampum Treaty here that you have in front of you from 1764, that was the culmination of, early peace and friendship treaties that were occurring from 1760, actually in the 1750s on the Atlantic. And that set the stage for the relationship that developed right up until the War of 1812, where First Nations fought as allies on the front lines against the Americans. And they were successful, otherwise this would be the United States right now. And that relationship continued until about the 1830s, when the settlers started to outnumber us. And by the time we get to the 1850s, we get the government passing laws telling us what to do, the first Indian Acts. And that culminated after Confederation in the 1876 Indian Act. And so the Indian Act, was part of the BNA Act. It was basically to manage us into extinction, like Gary was saying, and basically absorb us into the body politic. That's been certainly in the 1900s. That was the objectives. Even in 1945, Diamond Jeunesse had this 25-year plan to liquidate the Indian problem. In 1969, Chrétien and Trudeau had the 1969 white paper to repeal the Indian Act, amend the BNA Act to remove any reference to Indians, and basically absorb Indians into the provincial systems. That's continued to be the case even with Section 35, because the government's taken the position that there's a legal uncertainty because, there failed to be a political agreement in the 1980s. The courts have now laid out legal tests. But I guess the point I would make is that, the whole purpose of Section 35 was supposed to be a political negotiation. The courts were not supposed to be defining that because it's a political matter. Our right to self-determination and sovereignty is a political matter. And, the Canadian state is a settler state. It's based on this two founding nations concept, and it has not accommodated us. Section 35 is being used as a trap through these policies of negotiation, self-government and land claims, to get us to convert our original status into a new status, which is a lesser status, which is going to make us a municipal order government within the federal system. And it goes against what the Penner Report, the Indian Self-Government Report of 1983 said, which recognized we should be recognized as a distinct order of government. It goes against the recommendations in the 1996 Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. And the fact that Ottawa refuses to implement reports and recommendations like that are indicators to me that it is a racist colonial state. And unfortunately, we don't have the people that Mandela had in South Africa. He had the majority of people to change the system there. We're the demographic minority, so we have to enlist Canadians to help us get what some consider special rights, our Aboriginal treaty rights, recognized and affirmed like the Constitution says, because the government's policies are based on extinguishment and denial. and they're coercing us into signing these agreements. In BC, they've borrowed over almost $500 million to negotiate these so-called modern treaties, and the government's using those to blackmail them to enter into final agreements to extinguish their Aboriginal title and accept municipal status. And I guess I'd close off by saying that's why I think one of the contributing reasons why we haven't seen Section 35, the promise of that fulfilled, is because since those talks in the 1980s, they've got 93 what I call termination tables representing 403 communities. The majority of bands in the country are locked into these tables, and they don't want to leave because there's a cash flow involved, and the government's lording it over them on the loan funds that they've taken out. And Minister Valcourt just issued a statement just about a week ago where he's basically said, instead of responding to the Chilcotin decision, he's basically said he's appointed Douglas Eford, this lawyer, as a special representative to enter into the negotiations, and they want to focus on his report. And his report was on focusing on those First Nations who are on the corridors of the pipelines in British Columbia. So they're going to focus on them and try and speed up negotiations and throw money at them to try and get them to agree through modifying consultation processes to help them get their research done, whatever it takes to get them to agree to accepting the pipelines. That's my reading of his press release, because he certainly didn't address the Chilcotin decision and his recognition of Aboriginal title. He's continuing to use the comprehensive claims policy, which has been in effect since 1973, to extinguish Aboriginal title. And you know, I've been working with I Don't Know More, and I'm doing a webinar on the termination plan with them on August 18th. So what I'm going to continue to do is to try and educate you know, First Nations peoples and Canadians as to what this termination plan is about, and to organize and do something about it to stop it. And one of that is saying Canada's not entitled to celebrate 150 years in 2017 like they're planning on doing, because I don't think racism and colonialism should be celebrated. Canada has to address its past before we can move on. And that's what I have to say on it. Thank you.
Nyawa, Russ, really appreciate that. You know, I mentioned about the amount of taxpayers' dollars that are going into government legal fees, often to fight against First Nations Aboriginal rights. The millions of dollars that some of them have to borrow. I've been at events in British Columbia where they literally passed a hat, you know, to raise money for legal fees. And I should have acknowledged that we appreciate being able to hold our event on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Curve Lake. And Curve Lake and I see Shirley Williams here from Curve Lake, Professor Emeritus. Yeah, she's originally from Wikwemikong, unceded Indian Nation, but Curve Lake now. She has her roots there. And Curve Lake was one of 7, and I don't use the word signatories to most treaties, because you can't sign something unless you know what it says or can understand the language, or in the case of the Williams Treaty, we're allowed to have lawyers present. And in this great democracy, my grandfather, Moses Marsden, who had been the chief of Alderville, was in the room in Alderville when the government commissioners came to pitch the Williams Treaty. And he said all the Indians wanted to know. My grandfather wrote many years later, and he even remembered the commissioners' names. One of them was Uriah McFadden. And he said all the Indians wanted to know if they would still have their hunting rights and their fishing rights. And they were told yes. Like many of the agreements that were made with the honor of the Crown at stake, things were changed between the time it was discussed with the Indians. Sometimes things were added in or taken out, as was the case with Section 35. This is just not the honor of the Crown at stake here. And as I said, in a democratic country like Canada prizes itself to be, First Nations were not allowed to have lawyers represent their interests for many years, I think right up to the 1950s. 51. Most Canadians don't know these things. That's horrible. That's atrocious. That's like you'd see in a banana republic. And they don't grow any bananas in Canada that I know of. So, anyways, I'm going to introduce our next panelist, Wanda Nanabush from the Trent class of '96. Wanda is an Anishinaabe image and word warrior, curator, arts consultant, professor, and grassroots organizer from Beausoleil First Nation, which is considered a remote community because it happens to be on an island. Nanabush is currently content researcher and programming advisor for the Art Gallery of Ontario and associate professor at the University of Toronto teaching residential schools, truth, trauma, and reconciliation. Her exhibition, Kwe, which you should know is a Anishinaabe word meaning woman, Gwe, Algonquin too, I think. The Word of Rebecca Belmore is up until August 9th, which is tomorrow, at the Justina M. Barnaky Gallery. Nanabush was a 2013 Dame Nita Barrow Distinguished Visitor at University of Toronto. She's also curator in residence at the Justina M. Barnaky Gallery and has over 15 years experience in the arts sector of Canada. She's been published in many books and magazines with a focus on Indigenous rights and culture. And Wanda is going to talk about things that relate to her experience, but I'm glad that she said that she thinks that the recent so-called First Nations control of First Nations Education Act, which met a political demise and also led to the resignation of former National Chief Sean Atleo. She said she thinks it's a good example of how assimilation policies continue despite the so-called apology that Russ referred to by Stephen Harper in 2008. So thank you very much for being here, Wanda.
Hello, everybody. So I'm Wanda Nanabush, Mayengang Dodem, which is Wolf Clan. I come from the Menegs, the McHughes, the Nanabushes, the Tababadungs. We're a big, huge family. I'm the youngest of 19 from my mother. And I'm a second-generation residential school survivor. And I think that today I want to knit some ideas together that are floating around in my mind and just talk to you. And I want to, first of all, give props to Rosemary and Russ and Gary, who have been part of my formation of my thinking and acting over my lifetime. So I just wanted to thank you guys, and it's an honor to be here on a panel with you, and also with you as well. And I don't know you well enough yet, but I'm sure we're going to learn a lot from each other. And I'm going to be fast, because we don't even have 20 minutes left for 3 speakers. So I'm going to cut myself down in deference to my elders, and I want to make sure Rosemary has enough time. So one thing that I've been working on, well, I've been heavily involved in the Idle No More movement in the last couple of years as an organizer in the Toronto area, and also talking about strategy on a national level. And we've organized, all the big round dances, and we did teach-ins every month at the Toronto Council Fire, which our first teach-in, 250 people showed up, which is pretty crazy. So there is a real strong desire for knowledge, obviously. My interest is whether that knowledge turns to action. That's more what I'm interested in than people just knowing stuff. And how we can kind of work together towards a different future. And so we decided to base that relationship, because if you have a movement, that is cross-cultural, you have to have a basis for relating. And so we decided that the basis for our relationship was going to be nation to nation, and to put treaties and wampum sort of at the center of how we were going to go forward in action together. And then I'm not going to go into all the I don't know more stuff, but if you have questions, I'll totally answer them. What's on my mind right now, because I'm teaching a grad course on residential schools, truth, trauma, and reconciliation, is around my deep and profound anger at the apology. It doesn't make me happy at all. And primarily because it's a lie. And unfortunately, this is the story of a lot of things that happen in our relationship with Canada. And thinking about residential schools, not as a separate thing, but as Russ alluded to, as part of larger imperial policies and current colonial policies that knit together in a kind of net that catches us. And I think treating it in isolation actually does a disservice to how colonization takes place in this country today. One of the things I've been thinking about in terms of residential school is that, and I'm not going to focus on survivors. That is not my interest. My interest is on policy, because that's what we're here to talk about today, and the ways in which the current suite of policies that are coming out from the Canadian government and from Harper in particular, because it's a personal kind of, I think, platform of his, and deep in his bones he wants us to disappear. And I think that these suite of policies that Russ has alluded to the history of them, like with the white paper and all that kind of stuff, really, really tells you that the apology was a lie, because it's all about getting rid of us as Indigenous people. And I think with the I Don't Know More movement, what came out was a crisis in leadership. So who are we going to listen to as we go forward? Will we continue to allow people to negotiate on our behalf, and negotiate in the context that I think is a negotiation, is a slow negotiation of our own death as a people? Because I think slowly we just lose things, legislation by legislation, court case by court case, even though we keep lauding them as successes. And I'm usually not this pessimistic. Wow. I shouldn't have had a cigarette. But this is the pessimistic side, is always on the government negotiation side and on the court side. I mean, that's always a depressing situation, I think, and there's no way to get around that. But I think the most exciting side is what's happening on the ground in terms of communities and what communities are doing, and how there's been a network that's been developed where people are connected to each other. And so your individual fight on your land, in your territory, might be against the Canadian government, but it also might be against your own band government, which is, also tied into that system and was built by that system. And it might be against, other conservative forces around you. And that can be a very lonely place. There might be, in a small community, maybe 5 people who are interested in protecting their traditional territories beyond the reservation boundaries. And I think the isolation of that has been part of the problem, which Gary alluded to, is that we're much stronger when we are together. So I think that one of the things with Defenders of the Land and I Don't Know More that has been particularly exciting is the way that in which those people are now connected together. And I always think of it like the round dance or like spirit lines. It's like if you shake in one place and you're all shaking from across, the power of that is way stronger than if you're just standing, jumping in one spot all by yourself. And we can see that crisis in leadership came into education in terms of fighting a legislation that used our words against us. So this constantly happens, uses our desire for inherent rights and control over our own children and our own families. And control is such a white word. I really don't like that word, because I don't think we try to control our children or our families, but there we are. So the movement towards that has really been co-opted into let's give you as little resources as possible and as little control as possible to set you up for failure. And then we'll blame you for that failure, and then we will come in and run things again. And I think all of the legislation is sort of built that way, including in terms of child welfare. So we can look at education, we can look at child welfare. What's staggering to me is that there are over 27,000 Indigenous children in foster care at present, And that is more than the 9,000 children who were in residential school in 1940. So if you think of it in the past, you're just so wrong-headed, because actually that process of taking children away from our families and family breakdown is happening at a faster rate today than it has ever happened before in residential schools. And a lot of the kind of cultural assimilation, cultural superiority, and those kinds of attitudes are very much involved in that foster care system and very much involved in the child welfare system. And unfortunately, even the ones that are run by our own people, they have to mimic the same system of the non-native people. So if they have any radical ideas about doing full family trauma treatment, which is not that radical, but we are hampered in those kinds of processes. And we can't do those kinds of things under the rules that we are given and under the systems that we have to operate in. And to me, that's a continuation of that cultural superiority that everyone thinks has ended. Like you no longer think you're more superior, but you still think that your processes, your systems, and your way of doing things is better than anything we will come up with from our own cultural standpoint. So I think that's one of the continuations that we have to acknowledge. And I think that when I think politically, we have to start at the family and community and children level, because that's where a large part of the breakdown has happened, and that's also from where all of our governance springs. And if we want to revive our traditional governance ways, however you want to think about that, they will be changed. I think it has to start from that place of the family unit and the child as the center of the nation. The other, I guess, aspect of continuance is violence against Indigenous women. And we keep coming out with numbers, and now it's like 2,000 or it's 1,181. And I find it very painful to be reduced to a number and to stop thinking about who these women are and what lives they have led and how the Canadian population as a society and the government is responsible for that vulnerability and that violence. And so I think that moving ahead, I'd love to drop the word reconciliation, because reconciliation, like a scholar I won't mention because every time you mention his name it gets so like, rah! Contentious in the room, so I'll just say it from my own face. And that's, reconciliation is really about reconciling ourselves to colonization as it currently stands. And what we're looking for is a radical shift from an Indigenous place to redefine how we are going to build our societies, how we're going to govern ourselves, how we're going to take care of our children, all of that kind of stuff. Canada has to stop thinking it has the solutions. And reconciliation, we should really be talking about restitution. So when I think about when we're asking for $1.9 billion for whatever, for education, or we're asking for, the amount of money per foster child to be equivalent to that amount of money that goes into the non-native system, we're not asking for something that is a gift. I think it should be seen as restitution for the damage that has been done by the policies of Canada. And it has to be seen as compensation and restitution. And that's the only way we can go forward, because if you don't deal with the justice aspect and restitution first, then all you're asking us to do is accept the same thing over and over and over again. So I'm going to stop there.
Miigwech, Wanda, and when people, I know non-native people sometimes get very antsy when their country is being accused of racism and genocide and things like that, but she referred to the differential treatment. Like how else can you explain why a First Nation child going to a high school on reserve, that he or she is funded up to $8,000 less than a child would going just down the road to a provincial school? How else could you explain why, you know, the average cost of keeping First Nations children in care in this country is something like 25% less. I mean, you don't treat people, you know, as less than, and that's what is the challenge that Wanda mentioned, and I appreciate her remarks. Danielle Jeancart, class of '08, hails from Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan. She's of French, Métis, Cree, and Ukrainian ancestry. She is currently the Research and Administrative Coordinator at the Aboriginal Education Research Centre at the University of Saskatchewan. Since completing her master's degree, she's had the opportunity to guest lecture in the area of Indigenous history and politics, as well as develop and teach a course on Indigenous masculinity and the colonial imagery at the University of Regina. She has recently been published in the journal In Education and has a forthcoming short story in Neil MacLeod's, you have to help me pronounce this, Sikewizin? New Writing from Indigenous Saskatchewan. And Danielle has said that she wants to address the politics of representation and how the so-called Indian problem has been constructed by politicians, media discourse, and the general population in Canada. So, Danielle.
Hi. I'm going to go a little quicker just because we don't have that much time and I want to give Rosemary a chance to speak.
We'll just go.
I'm going to give her. I'm going to give her. Okay, so as Maurice mentioned, I had the opportunity to teach a class on Indigenous masculinities and the colonial imaginary. And so wherein we kind of looked at constructions of Indigenous masculinity and how these ideas and stereotypes were imposed upon Indigenous men throughout history. And why I found that course really interesting to teach, my students, they became very engaged with material. They were future educators, they were activists, and they were artists. So they had a lot of nifty things to say, and sometimes they got quite angry. But what got them very fired up was actually representation. It was representation over how their leaders, their Indigenous activists, the chiefs, how they've been misrepresented and often vilified by media discourse. And also, too, the construction of that Indian problem. And this Indian problem, I mean, it's been with us for well over a century, this idea of that problem and how it's been constructed and put forth in print and visual culture. And we've seen it most recently, actually, as of last week with the First Nations Transparency Act, wherein, you know, journalists take one story of a chief and it's everywhere. And it's kind of like a formula, in essence. You know, have you have one story, social media picks up on it, it gets disseminated, and then people, of course, are upset, and then they start talking about taxes, and it's just a common theme. But the idea of the corrupt chief, or the idea of corrupt Indigenous governments, or the idea that our Indigenous activists get framed by the media and the settler populace as villains, or even worse, that word terrorist has been thrown around quite a bit, especially that idea imposed upon our youth, that, you know, when you're resisting things like, you know, the government coming in and taking our resources or putting up a pipeline, you get called a terrorist. Pretty much taking away all meaning from what that word even means, you know, to put that on our youth. So a lot of you are probably thinking, I'm going to talk about stereotypes. Yes, but no. How we've been represented by the media carries a lot of weight, particularly when resisting government. Nifty things like omnibus bills and government-imposed policies. And while these constructions are completely divorced from the actual lived experiences of Indigenous people, they have been presented time and time again as the truth. Gerald Visner has this really interesting idea. It's called the simulations of dominance. And it kind of speaks to this myth of Canada. I like it because simulation kind of sounds Star Trek-y, so you kind of remember it. But representation of Indigenous peoples as rebellious, corrupt, lazy, while the settler populace had been situated as the opposite, repurposed the colonial viewpoint where notions and misnomer are read as authentic and sustained representations of Indigenous peoples. And further, these representations have been used to justify the continued regulation of Indigenous peoples' minds and bodies. And we can see that through government legislation, whenever a speaker in the House is talking and they bring up the vulnerable populations of Indigenous peoples and how they need to help us. So,
Don't help.
no, please stop helping us. And this is why I truly believe now more than ever, it's really, really crucial for emerging leaders, Indigenous youth, to really understand our story and our history and understand where these ideas come from. So the construction of Indigenous people as a villain, historically and contemporarily, lies at the very core of a unified Canada and the constructed idea of Canadian nationalism. So how does one create nationalism? I didn't even tell you to switch. Can you just a couple slides? Sorry, I'm trying to go quick. So, yeah. Okay, so I always go back to the 1885 resistance. One, it's special for me. My family fought in the resistance, and so I talk about it a lot. And I also think a lot of the ideas of what's happening now in terms of negative imagery emerged from the resistance, or as the Cree call, Egi Maigamga. And it's crucial to talk about how we've been represented at that time period. Now what we have, okay, so now we know the settler populists have been vilifying and romanticizing Indigenous peoples for a very long time because we have that really interesting civ-sav dichotomy that's been around forever. But the 1885 is very interesting in terms of white settler relationships with Indigenous people, because it has been framed over time as how the West has essentially been won. So we can talk about prior to the resistance, we had a lot of things happening. We had the decline of the buffalo. We had starvation policies being implemented. The government was not listening to Métis people in terms of the Manitoba Act. A lot of things were happening. There was resistance, no one was listening, and there was two separate movements. You had political mobilization happening. They like to be lumped together as one, but it was actually two. They were just happening at the same time. So, of course, there's growing social tensions. Settler anxiety is really, really acute, and everybody's kind of talking and not knowing what's going to happen. But what settler society had that Indigenous people didn't was they had the printing press. And I think it was mentioned already, no, Indigenous, we weren't sitting there with access to newspapers and stuff, but but the public was. And it's interesting because as such, they already had these ideas, these prejudices, but those pre-existing and largely unarticulated racial prejudices could be now articulated. People could read about it. You could look at pictures. I think that, actually you can go on a couple slides. Yeah, right there. Okay, so this one. Now these pictures are actually from the Illustrated War News, and they would have been pictures that more people out east would have seen versus out west. However, what's interesting about these types of pictures and this imagery is they were drawn by artists in like Toronto or Montreal or New York. And so it was their idea of what was happening in the West. At the same time too, in the West, we had, our own newspapers kind of like discussing the Indian problem and what was happening. Okay, so the accompanying stories. So things like, I always found it really interesting. One of the stories, for instance, was for the Métis. The Métis were, L'Oreal would have these secret meetings with the Fenian Brotherhood in Chicago because the Métis couldn't actually think of having a resistance themselves. They would have to bring in the Irish, and the Irish would teach them how to resist better because they couldn't have did it. Or, for instance, with the Indigenous populations, you had the Cree, the Saulteaux, and the Assiniboine allies. You had them kind of become completely demonized or vilified by the media. Very sensationalized stories of Indigenous people stealing white men's wives and selling them to half-breeds. That was like a common story that you heard constantly. So, okay. Go through here. So newspapers would daily report about the Indians and the half-breeds pillaging settlers, looting lands, and kidnapping and selling white women, as I mentioned. The next bit, though, if you go one slide. Oh, back. Sorry about that. Okay, these two depictions are interesting, though, and I wanted to bring them up in terms of talking about how the resistance was kind of framed. These are two actual events but they're framed by the media as, well, they're drawn by people that weren't here. So the one is the death of Thomas Scott. Now that didn't come out in 1885, that was 1870. However, this image became very prominent in how people framed Luriel's government. And it kind of, the idea of what a corrupted government looks like, what rebellion looks like, and who Luriel was, came out in this image. And this image was seen in 1885, and it was really prominent actually in the early 20th century when talking about how Métis people kind of work. Now, the other image was the Frog Lake Massacre. And again, that was actually something that actually happened. However, the person drawing it kind of went nuts, and yes, 9 people did die in this. We can't take away from the fact that it did happen. However, in both images, no one ever talked about in media discourse why it would even happen. Now, actually, I would argue that it happens more now in like 2014, where we actually talk about why this is significant and important. For instance, Luriel, I mean, this actually has been drawn time and time again. People actually don't even know what happened that day. But we do know that lots of people think the provisional government were drunk, and they knew that Thomas Scott was locked in a coffin, really upset and crying and things like that, which has been, these stories have been very interesting. In the other one, though, no one ever talks about the fact that the starvation policies were killing off the Cree. Or they don't talk about the corruption of the farm instructors, things like that were happening at the exact same time. So these are real events, but kind of like I mentioned before when we talk about we have one example and then we put it upon people. Well, these kind of pictures at that time became reference points. So even though I'm talking specifically just about Métis people, or I'm talking about Cree and Assiniboine and all their allies, these ideas of the vilification and the demonic nature, and that's what they said, of Indigenous people, was then imposed upon populations that didn't even take part in the resistance. So that is something that we can actually see now quite a bit. When, you know, one Indigenous person does this, well, as such, we're all like that. And you really see it here in the resistance. It comes out. Okay, so actively, Okay, so shortly after the battle ended, our leaders surrendered. 1885 resistance was over, and our leaders surrendered. Sir John A. Macdonald, this idea of the Indian problem comes up in legislation. He stands up and he says, "We have been pampering and coaxing the Indians. We must take a new course. We must vindicate the position of the white man. We must teach the Indians what law is." And I think this idea is something that we see now in current legislation. You could actually probably see Stephen Harper saying that too as well. In this practice, that meant the grievances of Indigenous peoples were inconveniences brought on by their own unwillingness to cooperate with the government of Canada. So it was framed as Indigenous people are deliberately causing their own problems. They should be happy we let them stay on this land. We taught them farming. And the government and newspapers all agreed. Even though, they didn't really teach them farming, they didn't really give them any tools. It was kind of framed as that, though. We've helped them. They should really settle down. And while Macdonald was kind of showing Indigenous people what the law was, and we kind of know what happened then. You have amendments to the Indian Act. You have the demilitarization of reserves. You have our leaders are locked up. Later on, the hanging of Luriel. But you have something really interesting happen in terms of ideas of nationalism. And you can see this construction come out. Because in order for us to have a unified Canada, there has to be a common enemy that we come together and celebrate when we defeat them. And that was Indigenous peoples at this time. And so then too as well, they were really cool with Macdonald getting that railway. So this all came together as celebrations all over Canada, where people were kind of rallying and saying that this is the best government we ever had. Mind you, it was the first government that Canada had ever had, but this is actually this kind of stuff that was perpetuated in newspapers. And thus, Canadian identity was born, and then rooted in the this constructed idea of what a nation is. So W.B. Cameron said it really well in 1907 when he kind of talked about this Indian problem, and it was in the Vermilion Signal. Times have changed since the stirring days of 1885. In 1907, the white among is numerically strong, and the red man too weak in the West, that this idea of the latter being a menace would seem ridiculous. But it will be no doubt interest some of the newer residents of the country to learn that within so short a time, so marked a transition would take place. This erasure is crucial to understanding the continued representation of Indigenous people by politicians in government and media. And we can kind of see that colonialism has definitely remained intact when it comes to media discourse. And so I could talk all day about how these ideas have been imposed upon Indigenous populations, particularly when we have resistance movements. There are things happening, even having conversations over legislation that we don't agree with. Somehow, we're always vilified. It just happens. So one of the best examples of this, just to jump to more contemporary things, and it was mentioned prior, Oka. Oka is a really good example, and Oka is really interesting in terms of if you were to actually put up pictures and newspaper discourse side by side, it's very scarily similar. And it shows that this idea, this construction of the Indian problem, and how our politicians and our media like to talk about us, hasn't changed much in over a century. It's always kind of the same story. So newspapers at this time, talking about Oka, and we can actually, talking about Oka held different views about the Indian problem, but what's interesting was the explosion of diverse narratives. And while Oka received international coverage, it was rare that any journalists actually, again, identified the root of the problem. They didn't really talk about why the Mohawk might be upset, over this golf course. But they really liked to vilify, again, especially the idea of the warrior. They really like to talk about the warrior and vilify him and her. So according to Anderson Robinson, who wrote a book about this, it's called Seeing Red, the various strands that exploded out of the discourse talking about Oka was like very pro-military, this kind of old school idea of colonization, saying, well, they need to actually, behave themselves, kind of thing. And also the term again, terrorist. They threw it out there again, terrorist, because these people were standing up for themselves. So also too, the government news releases kind of dominated the front pages, kind of making it look like they had a more official representation of what was happening. And a lot of the Indigenous writing was actually submerged and it wasn't really talked about. Okay, so, and there was an interesting counter-narrative that did emerge. You can probably click again. Oh. Hi. Yeah, no, just, yeah. Sorry. Okay, cool. So while much of the there was lots of harsh criticism leveled on the government, at the same time, too, you had these other avenues still okay with the ideas of colonization and still saying, okay, we should not be racist against this group of people. This is really wrong what the military and the government are doing, but, the Mohawk have to understand that they need to kind of back off. And so this kind of idea has been presented time and time again when talking about resisting. And so there's an interesting article in Prince George Citizen, and it was entitled Whose Lands, Whose Rights? And they kind of make light of the whole thing that was happening, and we see that time and time again, talking about these ever-increasing demands of Indigenous people, how they should be happy because we gave them mechanized cars and roads, and they should just deal with it. And this was in 1990 they were talking like that. But I'm going to conclude just after talking about the commentary of Oka and the type of rhetoric that we're seeing today. And I have it up here, and it's kind of interesting again, because this is from 2013, and it was around the time we were talking about I Don't Know More and what's going on now. And it says, Canada's Native community who are demanding unrealistic expectations of the government and who, in some cases, are acting like terrorists in their own country. So they're not actually specifically saying we're terrorists, but we're acting like them. So, Indians and natives want it all, but corruption and laziness prevent some of them from working for it. And that was 2013. And the thing is, these ideas have been designed for the explicit purpose of justifying colonial narratives.
The National Post.
But we all know, of course, that we are none of that. Like, we are none of these things. But time and time again, this identity has been imposed upon us. It's been imposed, and it scarily has been imposed upon our youth, who are actually just standing there at a roadblock. Okay, so this is why it's so crucial to know our history. It kind of gives us a framework of what has happened and what is happening and what we need to do to prevent these kinds of, or at least have a counter narrative or to these types of impositions. Okay, and to understand also how these ideas have emerged and been disseminated, and to be critical of the ever-increasing disjunction between images and rhetoric in the news as well as popular culture and the actual historical and contemporary realities of Indigenous peoples. And I think I'm going to end there. I'm a little fast.
Well,
I'm really fast.
Miigwech, Danny. I want to put people's minds at ease here. I may be exceeding my authority, but God bless him, the Chancellor put us behind time. And how many people here saw his presentation? Yeah, didn't he talk about the importance of two-way communication? So we're definitely going to have a question period after. The only thing it's interfering with, from my knowledge, is lunch with the Chancellor, so I'm sure he will understand. Okay. So, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate Danny and Wanda for, taking really well-prepared information and trying to condense it, but I think they've done a wonderful job of making their points, so miigwech very much. And the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples said in 1996 that most Canadians only know through their media Aboriginal people as noble environmentalists, angry warriors, or pathetic victims.
I'm all three.
Yeah. So, so it's changed, and I encourage you, if you want to see what racism looks like, just check on some websites after newspapers post stories about First Peoples. It's frightening. It's frightening. The National Post, by the way, was advocating for assimilation editorially, advocating for something that the Prime Minister had apologized for. So, yeah, the media are... yeah. Well, I'm so pleased that Rosemary Kaptana is...
I can waive my presentation.
No.
Take questions.
No, Rosemary is our keynote presenter.
Let's get to it.
Yes. Rosemary was born in an igloo. She became involved in Inuit rights issues in 1975 at a time when discussions regarding Inuit land rights between Inuit and the Government of Canada were taking place. In 1979, she joined the CBC and subsequently joined the Inuit Broadcasting Corporation as a production coordinator and its president from 1983 to 88. From 1986 to 89, she was the Canadian Vice President for the Inuit Circumpolar Conference. From 1991 to 96, she served as president of the Inuit Tapirasat of Canada, where she led negotiations seeking recognition of the inherent right of self-government of Indigenous peoples and came close to winning. In 1995-96, she was president of the Inuit Circumpolar Conference and helped establish the Arctic Council. Rosemary has received many awards for her service in the protection of Inuit culture and Inuit rights from a holistic Inuit perspective. She was instrumental in ensuring that the Migratory Convention Act of 1995 was passed. In the last 10 years, she has worked on the Inuit residential school experience and ensured that Inuvialuit received compensation as well. She's written articles and worked on the emergent issue of Arctic sovereignty and security, the Inuit Sea. The fact that Indigenous, in her topic, the fact that Indigenous and specific Inuit leadership is passing to a new generation of educated people, proud of their heritage, gives rise, gives vision, gives hope that the horrors of the past can be put to rest and a new dawn welcomed. And I should also say that Rosemary's vision of the future of a young generation includes her son James, who's here and who graduated from Trent last year. So, Rosemary.
Juana, I'm going to try and be quick. Much has happened over the last 50 years of Inuit-settler relations that has been shaped by politics and policy. We have moved from colonial objects with disnumbers to a renewed sense of peoplehood as we assert our inherent sovereignty and inherent rights in our traditional territories. We are deeply committed to joint decision-making over lands and environment issues. We have so much more than a mere right to be consulted on people's projects in our traditional territories. My own life reflects this in numerous ways. My siblings and I were born on the land. I was born on the sea ice of the Prince of Wales Strait in an igloo to parents who proudly held and a community, Ikahuk, known to outsiders as Sachs Harbor, which continues to hold the knowledge and culture of Inuvialuit and our language, Inuit Naktun, that has flourished for a millennia. I experienced settlement. I lived the horrors of federal residential school policies. I witnessed the influx and imposition of many foreign ways of living and thinking. For instance, I witnessed my father's hunt being stolen by the RCMP because he got the geese out of season, based upon imported laws without consultation with those of us impacted by such impositions. We did not eat for 5 days, and my mother had a miscarriage as a result. I witnessed the RCMP enslave my mother, who sewed winter clothing for the police without pay. Is not fear and the fear of unbridled and unexplained exercise of foreign authority one element of an occupation by force without consent? Ask a person from Denmark, France, or Holland who lived through the first half of the 1940s. Can the hailed victorious liberator also be seen as wearing the respectful scowl of the occupier? Among the more positive developments over the last 50 years is detectable progress at the citizenry level concerning environmental issues. We can see this in the wide block of opposition to pipeline development in British Columbia and to the tar sands development issues more generally, and by the fact that many individual Canadians cheered on the Idle No More movement. Unfortunately, this environmental awareness and concern is not reflected in environmental policy or legislation of certain governments in Canada, and in particular, the federal government. The overall trend of policy making federally promotes a steady march towards ecocide in some parts of Canada. It is a very slow, yet deliberately self-inflicted harm through the regular poisonous drip of toxic effluents accumulating in the land and water. This arrogant and naive attitude about the capacities and limitations as humans is perhaps best represented by one of the most ridiculous and dangerous of human creations, those hyper-toxic chemical soups referred to as tailing ponds. And yet, it is still Indigenous people who are the most directly affected, who still have the most intimate knowledge and the oldest knowledge traditions about the land and the delicate balance of our relationships as humans to it. The state of the present conversation about the environment suggests to me that the gap between Indigenous peoples' environmental norms and those of governments will generate more friction over the short and medium term. There are obvious human rights implications to this gulf in environmental stewardship norms and standards. Inuit approaches to politics and policy making is perhaps best described as principled pragmatism. This is reflected in our positions on the complex relationship between human rights, Indigenous knowledge, development, and the environment. We have a well-established reputation as political actors who focus on what can be accomplished in any situation. We strive to work collaboratively with other peoples through negotiation and participation or partnership of all kinds, from business to political arrangements to environmental protection. However, we are always guided by fundamental notions of what is right and by the long game. Too often, non-Inuit underestimate our attachment to values of equality and fairness and our expectation that others will so treat us. The issues facing Indigenous peoples are obviously complex when we look at social development, economic development, political development, and environmental protection. With the increase in decision-making flowing from land rights agreements in Inuit territory, for example, there is an increased need for collaboration between Inuit governments, organizations, and territorial, provincial, and federal governments. Unfortunately, our constitutionally protected land rights agreements are too often undermined by failures of our government partners to bring any real enthusiasm or commitment to agreement implementation. Too often, our cultural norms of cooperation with others are taken for granted, abused, or exploited. With this in mind, I want to talk about how concepts of fundamental human rights concepts play out in politics and policy today for Inuit and other Indigenous peoples in Canada. Human rights are fundamentally about regulating power relations. For example, in the case of individual human rights, the power of states to affect the lives of individuals are circumcised to protect fundamental rights and freedoms, like the freedom of speech and physical security. In the case of collective and human rights of each people to self-determination, it is power relations between peoples that are regulated by international law. Specifically, colonial domination and theories of racial or cultural superiority in whatever form are no longer to be tolerated, including their residual life in the Canadian domestic law respecting Aboriginal and treaty rights. Member states of the UN are obligated to root out and remedy the impacts of their such colonial enterprises and to renounce colonial aspects of legal thinking, such as denial of Indigenous peoples' inherent sovereignty. One of the most critical policy issues facing federal and provincial governments is their relationship with Indigenous peoples. And the reason these governments have not been performing very well on many fronts is their lack of interest in bringing human rights frames of analysis in areas like environmental protection and regulation of development, as these affect Indigenous peoples in all parts of Canada. An essential ingredient to change this path is for these governments to overcome their resistance to work with Indigenous peoples on plans to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Although the relationship between development and human rights include the right to self-determination is well settled under international law, domestically, federal and provincial governments do everything possible to avoid discussing development and environmental management issues in human rights terms. Inuit have been leaders in articulating connections between international human rights norms and collective rights of Indigenous peoples. In addition to fighting alongside our Indigenous brothers and sisters for the adoption of UNDRIP, Sheila Watt-Kluche, a former head of the ICC, or the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, led an effort to have the link between climate change and the human rights of Indigenous peoples recognized. Although a petition to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights about 9 years ago was not successful, Inuit have continued to articulate a human rights perspective on the challenge of climate change in many international forums. And by the way, I think that climate change is not only an Arctic sovereignty issue, but it will have to address the human rights issue of statelessness in small island states such as the Maldives and Vanuatu. In the years since our first effort, there is evidence of an increased acceptance that human rights issues should be examined in dealing with climate change at the international, national, and subnational level. A human rights analysis was also a key underpinning of the constitutional analysis and positions we brought to the Charlottetown Accord negotiations. We did this, for example, by speaking about the relationship between our Aboriginal and treaty rights, our inherent right of self-government, and the international principle of the equality of peoples and our right under international human rights law to self-determination. All of this boils down to the need for a recalibration of power sharing. There is a role in that recalibration of the Supreme Court of Canada. Sooner or later, it is going to have to integrate a human rights analysis using UNDRIP and other international human rights instruments in its analysis of Section 35 of the Constitution 1982. The 2007 United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples essentially requires states such as Canada to adopt a human rights-based approach to social, economic, cultural, and political development issues affecting Indigenous peoples. Such an approach should be a touchstone in the development of any policy that affects the situation of Indigenous peoples. It is clear that the current federal government has no interest in an approach that even a human rights-based approach to development has been adopted and applied elsewhere around the world, especially where peoples have experienced colonization. Although the international human rights system is neither perfect nor completely free of Eurocentrism, it does at least start from certain fundamental premises that are very valuable, such as the equality of all peoples at a collective level and their equal right to determine their future as peoples, economically, culturally, socially, and politically in their territories. Another game changer is the fact that the generation of Indigenous peoples now moving into leadership positions clearly expect more progress on the respect and power sharing front and has learned a lot from the negotiation, political and policy experiences of my generation. They will not so much rely, as we did, on the negotiation table. There is a renewal of creative activism, as you can see, powered by the energetic intelligence of youth that will dismantle the old excuse of blocking real power sharing. They are not hampered to the same degree we were with the double duty of residential school healing process and leadership. They have higher levels of formal education while also working very hard to maintain and promote Indigenous knowledge, traditions, and values. The younger generation is embracing and developing Indigenous knowledge frameworks to examine issues of gender equality and how gender equality intersects with other forms of oppression, such as racism, ableism, and discrimination based on sexual orientation. I'm really looking forward to seeing the junior elders, as I call them, carry the torch of Indigenous activism to a place where governments in this country will truly engage us as equal partners in joint decision-making, whether they like us or not. Any new approach to relationships with Indigenous peoples will require integrating international human rights norms respecting Indigenous peoples in Canada's domestic policy making, and this will require real conversation between settler governments and Indigenous peoples. We're certainly in a new dawn.
Thank you so much,
Sorry,
Rosemary.
I was so rushed.
No, thank you so much. Gary and myself and Russell specifically want to thank you for referring to the young activists that we are. Thank you very much. We are going to make time for questions, and if you can't get answered here, you're all invited to the Chancellor's lunch.
I think that it's interesting because I think Indigenous people are the kind of front lines of I'll just call it a spade, like an anti-capitalist kind of push. And I think that there is the problem, because what we're asking to be supported in is our inherent sovereignty, not necessarily just the anti kind of pushback against the oil sands or the pushback against whatever the environmental issue is of the time. So when we build these alliances, sometimes that part's missed, is that you have to support the underlying kind of sovereignty of Indigenous people. And in that situation, yeah, you are taking a gamble because because the nobility in environmentalism is still based on a white idea of what an environmentalist is and what our relationship to land is and all that kind of stuff. And we have a totally different idea of what our relationship to that land is and what our relationship is going to be going forward. And some communities might just do the exact thing that you don't want them to do, but that's actually their right, because it is their territory and is their land. My feeling is that there are a lot of Indigenous people that don't want these things to go forward in the way that they're happening, and they don't want to destroy their territories and lands. So overall, yeah, not imposed, but also I think there is an underlying thing in culturally related to land that means you don't want its destruction, because it is the destruction partially of your culture. But don't put that in that kind of romantic framework where we're just children of the forest running around feeling happy with the bees, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Perhaps I can frame it another way, in that Inuit view environmental issues and other issues as all being integrated and interconnected, that the earth in itself is one ecosystem with many pockets of small ecosystems. So what necessarily happens in one part of the world will have an impact on another part of the world. And it is unfortunate that science tends to view these issues from a reductionist point of view, and yet science that created the problems don't often have the answers to take care of these problems. And the other fact that Don Tapscott referred to is this whole notion of, you know, the expert American, because they don't view Mark Lemont, who is did legal discourse at Harvard, referred to the U.S. position in that the United States say that the environmental issue is very complex, it's a global phenomenon, it's going to be happening anyway, and that it's a long-term challenge. Well, while I may agree with those to some degree, they're not completely right, and they have not looked at all of the underlying impacts of climate change in other fora.
How would First Nation self-determination work? Yeah. Yeah.
My own view is that it's up to each band or community to figure out how they're going to get out of the impacts that the Indian Act has done to them. Because the Indian Act has done damage to all 633 communities to a greater or lesser degree. Some embraced the Indian Act more, some resisted it more, because there's many provisions in the Indian Act. If you don't have a reserve, and there are bands without reserves, a lot of the provisions of the Indian Act didn't apply to them. I work for one of the communities that never had a reserve set aside for them, but they're recognized as a band. The Royal Commission encouraged this idea of working at the nation level, where the bands would form a larger groupings under the original nations that they were. But if you're going to take Indigenous self-determination on its face, it's up to each community to decide how they're going to get out of the mess they're in. The problem is the government's saying if you want out of the Indian Act, the only doorway is into this self-government policy. And they're interpreting Section 35 to say, okay, you know, again, it goes back to this is what your constitutional rights to self-government will be if you reach an agreement with us according to the terms of this policy. And the terms of the policy is you have to accept federal and provincial powers to override First Nations powers in any self-government agreement. And some are going for it. Some have compromised their constitutional rights. Some groups, you know, I could name them, but they're there. They've accepted it. And I'm saying it's unfair to the right of self-determination for those groups to be forced into having to make that choice. But that's their choice. What the government has done now is, with the suite of legislation that they've passed, the First Nations Transparency Act, the Matrimonial Real Property Act, the Water Quality Act, there's like about 10 different bills.
Yeah.
And I was Indian Act Amendments Coordinator under Ovid McCready in 96, 97. We fought a regressive package of Indian Act Amendments when Ron Irwin was Minister of Indian Affairs in Cretchen, a majority government. And we convinced the chiefs in layman's terms. We did a critical analysis and said this is worse than the status quo. It should be rejected. And the chiefs agreed with us. And we launched a campaign, and we basically kicked their butt, and Irwin didn't even run in the next election, and they dropped, it died on the order paper. AFN failed to do a proper critical analysis because of, you know, their approach to want to be collaborative with the Harper government.
Yeah.
They didn't do their due diligence, and they didn't do an analysis of how are all these bills going to change the Indian Act into the super consolidated Indian Act that it's become now. Because it's a new beast. So whether you stay under this Indian Act or go into the self-government policy negotiations, they're both self-termination because they're both limiting your choices and saying you're going to be assimilated into the Canadian Federation at a municipal level. You will not be able to organize at a larger nation level to exercise what the Royal Commission called core powers, because they identified core areas of jurisdiction and shared areas of jurisdiction. Family, child welfare was an example of a core area jurisdiction. The ability to raise our own children without being told by the state how we're going to do it. Or the ability to educate our children.
Yeah.
You know, the First Nations Education Act.
Yeah.
Again, which is amending the Indian Act. And that bill is not, it's still before Parliament. They haven't withdrawn it.
Totally done.
It's on hold, but when Parliament comes back in the fall, Valcourt and Harper might just say, oh, well, you know, the Assembly of First Nations didn't give us a clear answer, and for the children's sake, we have to do this. Because, you know, Harper's taken this paternalistic approach in all this legislation. So I guess the only thing I'm saying is it's up to each community to decide that's what form of self-government will take, at what scale, how they'll cooperate with other communities. It's up to them to decide that. It's not up to the provincial or federal orders of government to dictate the terms. Like I said, if we had millions of people like the Black South Africans had, we'd be dictating the terms more directly. But we have to convince a lot of Canadians to support us to have our Aboriginal treaty rights accommodated within the Canadian state on terms that we want, that are fair and address the historic injustices we've had to endure for generations. And that's what we have. That's why I said Canada should not be allowed to celebrate its 150th anniversary unless it addresses this racist colonial past before we can move on. I mean, that's the maturity of a settler state would be to reconcile in a real way with its Indigenous peoples. New Zealand has to do it. Australia has to do it. You know, there were only 4 countries that voted against the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It was Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand.
Yeah.
All former colonies of the British Empire. And they're all trying to control and manage Indigenous peoples to their extinction. And Canada reluctantly said, okay, we'll recognize it as an aspirational document. But, you know, there's a big gap between domestic Aboriginal policy and the articles of the UN Declaration. Mm-hmm. You know, as big as the Grand Canyon, I'd say. And we have a long ways to go in this country before we're anywhere near addressing the real issues. And, you know, you've seen the demographics, I think, of the youth. A lot of them are impatient, angry, and don't have a real good sense of, you know, their history and rights. They feel intuitively that, you know, they've been wronged. I saw it during the I Don't Know More movement. There was a lot of youth out there that all they could articulate was the treaties and self-determination. They weren't talking about the omnibus bills that the organizers, you know, started the I Don't Know More movement on. They were talking about fundamental feelings that they had, and the more educated ones in the urban areas feel that they don't have any hope because they're not getting any real opportunities in this country because they're discriminated against. And it's a systemic, structural, you know, relationship that Indigenous peoples have had to endure with the Canadian state. And all the provinces are trying to dominate us continually. I think Wanda and Danny illustrated that very well. And Rosemary, you know, did a good overview too, I think. So, the bottom line is that's what self-determination is. We have to decide for ourselves. Instead, what we're getting from the state is self-termination. Whether we stay in the Indian Act as amended or go into the door of self-government, door number 1, 2, or 3, you know.
Thanks, Russell. I'd like to give you a couple of specifics about that. I've worked for political organizations. Curve Lake First Nation, on whose traditional territory we sit, they had a problem several years ago with a drug dealer who moved into their community. And everybody knew that this person was creating a problem. They had residence by virtue of being a partner of a band member, a citizen. And they decided they were going to get together as a council, and they tried to banish this person. It went to court, and the judge said this is against this person's human rights, banishment. And as is always the case, when a community doesn't have their own recognized legal system, their own laws, the default is to provincial and or federal laws. Curve Lake is now one of the 39 member communities of the Anishinaabe Nation that are working on their own constitution, creating their own laws, which we had before our progress was interrupted several hundred years ago. Those are, when you asked where are you going to get these ideas, well, we had them. And we're trying to undo what's covered them up. As the prophecies of the fires say, our elders went to sleep. And through things like residential schools and, you know. The RCMP had a hand as well. There was, you know, there was a forceful things done. Like I said, banana republics, you enforce laws at gunpoint. But when we restore our jurisdiction one way or another, I think we can get caught up, and some people get caught up in whether other people should recognize, whether other people's constitutions should recognize these promises. But if we have our own constitutions, that's what counts. An elder I know says, not Indian Act, act Indian. That's exercising our jurisdiction, making our own laws, and it's not an easy, it's like starting from square one. Nipissing First Nation had a constant fight with the local anglers, fishers and anglers, the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, about what they claimed was overfishing of Lake Nipissing by the First Nation. They have a right under the Robinson-Huron Treaty to fish 365 days a year, day, night, whenever they want. The community created its own fishing law. It established that they would not fish during spawning season. They created their own fish hatchery and their restocking league. Nobody else is doing that. MNR stopped doing that. And they have their own law. It's being enforced best they can. There are people who break it, like there are people who break everybody's laws, and they're going to be punished. So we have the ability, but the government has tried to create the impression that we're not smart enough to manage our own affairs. The other thing they like to do is try to aggregate everything. They say, well, we can't deal with 600 individual First Nations. Those are the treaty holders. The Assembly of First Nations, the Anishinaabe Nation that I've worked for, they don't hold rights. Those communities, they're the ones that treaties were made with. There were 24 of them here. And we can do it if people just believe. You know, our own people have to believe they can do it first. And we've proven so many times in so many ways that we're capable of doing good things and contributing. So these things are starting to happen, and the young leadership will push the movement forward and faster on it. So
I think simply put, you know, it's not a level playing field. All of the rules are set by the colonial governments, and we have to abide by those rules. So they're not willing to, let's say, negotiate on the principles for the negotiation and then work on the details. Mm-hmm. If I might just add, in that regard, Inuit had to work within that framework, but today Inuit are the largest landowners in the world.
I guess I would add too that the real reality of it is that to exercise your jurisdiction and your life as an Anishinaabe, myself, is to enter the world of illegality as a person in this country. So to actually do it, to assert jurisdiction, is to break the law, right? And so that's the reality, and that's the choice that we're constantly having to ask ourselves, like how much can we do that, right? And what will be the real repercussions, which is why we keep heading to the negotiation tables, which are killing us. So.
We really should, I guess, go to the Chancellor's lunch. I do want to thank, really, Gary Potts and Russell Daibo and Wanda Nanabush and Danielle Jean Cart and Rosemary Captana for articulating some of the issues that we face. I don't like there to be any gathering involving First Peoples that goes away thinking that we're problems, because that's one of the stereotypes, that we're problems, we block progress, we're poverty cases, we're welfare cases, we're all this. And I think our problem is a communication one. We haven't had people with printing presses, has been said. We haven't been able to convince subsequent generations that we gave at the office big time. We made contributions. You know, we gave the first people who cultivated potatoes were Indigenous peoples. They weren't Irish. The first people who cultivated tomatoes were not Italians. They were Indigenous peoples. The Iroquois people, the Haudenosaunee people cultivated 70 hybrids of corn. These are very sophisticated people. And as Russ said, if it hadn't been for our contributions in the War of 1812, there would not be a Canada. Even Stephen Harper as much as admitted that. And I don't agree with very many things he said, but I happen to agree with that one. So we gave, and we continue to give. We've given this university the land on which it sits. I just want to leave with a comment that I heard from Elijah Harper the last time I heard him speak. He said in Ottawa, he said, Canadians have to stop waiting for governments to do the right thing.